I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's September 27th, and we have a lot to talk about. Just in case you missed it, last week we celebrated the 5th anniversary of the launch of Real Talk MS, and although I find it hard to believe even as I say it, I want to welcome you to year number 6 of this podcast. And while we're talking about things that might be hard to believe, I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear me say that making MS research accessible to people affected by MS is important. It's the reason Real Talk MS exists. When I launched this podcast, I saw remarkable work being done by brilliant scientists in laboratories around the world. But most of the time, that work was only being described in complex, technical terms. And those descriptions only seemed to appear in scientific journals that most ordinary civilians were never going to read. I wanted to break down the scientific jargon into easy-to-understand English because I believed then, and I believe today, that people affected by MS would be a little more encouraged about the future if they had a better understanding of the outstanding science that was taking place today. Over the past couple of months, I've discovered someone else who shares that opinion. Sharon Roman is a patient partner and writer for the British Medical Journal Group. Sharon lives with MS, and she also writes a blog called Tremlett's Research Explained. The blog features plain English posts detailing the research being done by Professor Helen Tremlett and her team. Professor Tremlett is the Canada Research Chair in Neuroepidemiology and Multiple Sclerosis at the University of British Columbia, and she also happens to be a friend of this podcast. Sharon Roman joins me in today's episode to talk about Professor Tremlett's pioneering research on the prodromal phase of MS. And we'll talk about why it's so important to make MS research accessible and understandable to everyone in the MS community. But before we get to my conversation with Sharon Roman, there are a few other things that you should know about. "80% of the people living with MS experience fatigue. And if you're among that 80%, I don't have to tell you how MS-related fatigue just gets in the way of fully engaging in life. It can affect your job performance. It can impact your relationships at home. Fatigue can get in the way of any and every area of life. And while there's no medication that's been shown to be effective in managing fatigue, there are things you can start doing today that have been shown to ease fatigue among people with MS. Newly published results of a study in Sweden show that once-a-week sessions of high-intensity resistance training, consisting of strength exercises followed by a short recovery period between sets, was effective in easing fatigue among people with MS who were experiencing low energy and tiredness. And as a bonus, this weekly workout regimen was also shown to reduce feelings of depression and anxiety and improve health-related quality of life. The trial itself included 62 women and 9 men who had been diagnosed with, at minimum, moderate fatigue. 70 of the study participants were living with relapsing remitting MS, and 1 study participant was living with primary progressive MS. More than half of the study participants reported already doing at least 2.5 hours of aerobic physical activity every week. Now, 36 of the study participants were randomly placed in a group receiving once-weekly sessions of high-intensity resistance training, and 35 study participants were randomly placed in a group receiving twice-weekly sessions of the same training. Each 60-minute training session began with a 5 to 10-minute warm-up on a stationary bike, followed by 4 upper body exercises and 3 lower body exercises on various training machines. This was followed by a whole body plank exercise, and the session concluded with 5 to 10 minutes of stretching exercises to cool down. Each exercise was repeated 15 times in weeks 1 and 2 of the study, 10 times in weeks 3 and 4, and 7 times in weeks 5 through the end of the study at week number 12. There was no rest between the repetitions, and there were 3 sets of each exercise with a 1 to 3 minute rest between each set. Both groups in this study experienced clinically meaningful reductions in fatigue, with no real differences associated with either the once-weekly or twice-weekly training schedule, although the group receiving twice-weekly training was shown to experience further improvement in anxiety and depression. The research team found that these encouraging results extended beyond just feeling less fatigue. In analyzing blood samples, they noted that improved fatigue was associated with changes in inflammatory protein levels measured in each study participant's blood. It seems almost antithetical to think that the path to improving fatigue is through increasing your physical activity, but that's something that's been shown to be true in other studies, and this latest study provides further evidence that finding ways to increase your physical activity may provide you with more energy to enjoy all the other parts of your life. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Another study from Europe also looked at improving MS-related fatigue among other MS symptoms, but it did so from a different perspective and with a different treatment approach. This study followed 18 people with highly active relapsing MS who underwent autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, or AHSCT. The mean age in the group was 36.3 years. 13 of the participants were female and 5 were male. The research team evaluated each study participant before their stem cell treatment, and then at 3, 12, and 24 months after their treatment. At 3 months following AHSCT, 14 of the study participants showed an improved EDSS score. EDSS stands for Expanded Disability Status Scale, which is the standard used to measure and track physical disability among people living with MS. What the research team described as a significant improvement in physical functioning, vitality, and pain was seen just 3 months following AHSCT, and this improvement was sustained at month 12 and at month number 24. An improvement in fatigue was seen at 12 months following AHSCT, and it was sustained at month 24. And all of these improvements had a positive impact on the study participants' health-related quality of life. Admittedly, this was a small study. However, the results of the study reflect the same outcomes that have been noted in other studies, supporting the conclusion that for people living with MS who fit a fairly specific profile, autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is highly effective in reducing disability and sustaining that improvement for years to come. So, what is that specific profile? Who are the people who are most likely going to benefit from AHSCT? Studies show that the best candidates have relapsing remitting MS, are less than 50 years old, they've had MS for less than 10 years, and they've experienced new inflammatory lesions on MRI or relapses despite treatment with a high-efficacy disease-modifying therapy, or they may be unable to take a high-efficacy DMT. Now, those high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies include Tysabri, Lemtrada, Ocrevus, Rituxan, and Mavenclad. In providing guidance on autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, the National MS Society also points out that factors including older age, greater disability, and certain health conditions like heart or lung disease are all associated with an increased risk of life-threatening side effects following AHSCT. If you'd like to review the details of this latest study, or if you'd like to review the National MS Society's guidance on autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, you'll find those links in today's show notes. Research continues to provide evidence that the path to altering the immune system goes through the gut. And the International Multiple Sclerosis Microbiome Study analyzed the gut microbiome of 576 people with MS, along with 576 genetically unrelated people from the same households who served as healthy controls. The reason the research team recruited unrelated people from the same households as the people living with MS was first to rule out any sort of genetic relationship between the patient group and the healthy control group, and because they were comparing people from the same household, they can eliminate any differences in the environmental factors that might have affected the gut microbiome in both groups. Study participants were recruited from 7 different recruiting centers in the United States, South America, and Europe. And just a quick refresher, the gut microbiome is made up of trillions of microorganisms along with their genetic material that live in our intestinal tract. And in this study, the researchers analyzed stool samples and blood samples from all the participants and saw that the gut bacteria among the people living with MS was different than the gut bacteria in the healthy control group. The research team identified 16 species of bacteria that were present in significantly higher amounts in MS patients, and 7 bacteria species that were present in lower levels among the MS patients when compared to the healthy control group. Taking their analysis a step further, the research team saw that among progressive MS patients, certain bacteria species were associated with less severe disease, and one specific species of bacteria was associated with more severe disease. The team was also able to identify similar associations between specific species of bacteria and more or less severe disease among people with relapsing remitting MS. And the researchers identified how some disease-modifying therapies interacted differently with the gut microbiome. For instance, levels of one specific bacteria were increased among people who were on interferon therapies, but decreased among people who were on Tysabri or Copaxone. Now, the results of this research could eventually lead to the development of specialized probiotics designed to interact with specific bacteria and rebalance the gut microbiome in someone living with MS. It's too soon to tell what the outcome of that kind of treatment might be, but as scientists continue to identify pathways to stopping central nervous system inflammation at the source, you can be sure that they'll continue the work of better understanding the role the gut microbiome plays in regulating our immune system. If you'd like to learn more about this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Early this year, a research team at Harvard published the results of a very large study concluding that multiple sclerosis is triggered by the Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV. Now, when you consider that more than 90% of the world's population carries the Epstein-Barr virus, but quite clearly 90% of the world's population doesn't have MS, we can also conclude that the Epstein-Barr virus is necessary but not sufficient to cause MS. It's a part of the equation. That's why it's considered a trigger. But there's more to developing MS than just EBV. And to sort of explain the excitement about this discovery, if scientists can mitigate EBV, if they can create an Epstein-Barr vaccine, well, that vaccine eliminates the thing that triggers MS, which eliminates most of the MS in the world. So, as you might well imagine, there's an awful lot of heightened scientific interest around Epstein-Barr virus and MS. And a team of scientists from Germany, France, the pharmaceutical company Roche, and the biotech company Adaptive Biotechnologies analyzed T cells in the immune systems of 1,395 people with MS and 887 people who didn't have MS, who served as healthy controls. And the researchers discovered that the study participants with MS had significantly more T cells that were equipped with receptors that specifically recognize the Epstein-Barr virus when they compared them to the study participants who didn't have MS. Now, receptors are molecules that different substances like hormones, drugs, or antigens can bind to. And an antigen is any substance that causes your immune system to produce antibodies. So what this research is demonstrating is that compared to someone who doesn't have MS, a person with MS seems to have significantly more T cells in their immune systems that recognize the Epstein-Barr virus and release antibodies. That T cell receptor recognizes EBV, and that triggers an immune attack against EBV. But the number of T cells, and therefore receptors, are higher in someone living with MS, so that immune attack is stronger. In this same study, the researchers then looked at sets of identical twins where one twin had MS and the other didn't. And even among the identical twins, the twin who was living with MS had the same increase in EBV-specific receptors compared to the identical twin who didn't have MS. And what's really interesting here is that we know identical twins are genetically identical, and they generally have similar experiences throughout their childhood. So the riddle here is if the twins share the same identical DNA, and for the most part, the same childhood experiences, so they're exposed to the same set of environmental factors, how, when, where, and why does one twin develop more T cells with receptors that are specific to Epstein-Barr virus than the other twin who doesn't? I have to admit that describing this riddle feels a little like we're doing a true crime podcast. So more research is really required here to better understand what's happening to those T cells and why. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Over the past few minutes, we've looked at just a few studies that ran the gamut from measuring the outcome of autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation to understanding the role of EBV-specific T cell receptors in people with MS. It's pretty complex science, but it's also fascinating science. These are the steps, some of the work that's being done every day that ultimately lead to better treatments and then cures for MS. And when I share this work with you, I do my very best to translate some of that complex science into easier to understand English. It's not always easy, and if you look behind the curtain, you'd see that it can take hours to distill the 15 minutes of news that I include in every podcast episode. But I think hearing about that science is important. There's amazing research going on, and you should have access to that research in terms that you can understand, even if you're not a scientist. Well, my guest, Sharon Roman, thinks this is pretty important too. She's spent years making MS research accessible to a non-scientific audience, and now Sharon's involved in a project that I'm particularly excited about. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Sharon Roman. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise when I say that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to translate science into easier to understand plain English. It's what this podcast is all about. I believe that making MS research accessible to people affected by MS is important. And it turns out I'm not the only one who thinks about these things. Sharon Roman is a patient partner and writer for the British Medical Journal Group. She's a member of the Patient Advisory Board for the Canadian Medical Association Journal and Participant Advisory Committee for the Brain Wellness Program at the Javid Moafagian Center for Brain Health. Sharon also served a full term on the Patient Editorial Board for the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry, and she's an MS Society of Canada volunteer. Welcome to the podcast, Sharon.
Thanks, John. It's a great pleasure to be here.
You and I first became acquainted through some of the work you're doing, writing a blog called Tremlett's Research Explained.
The blog features plain English posts detailing the research being done by Professor Helen Tremlett. Professor Tremlett is the Canada Research Chair in Neuroepidemiology and Multiple Sclerosis at the University of British Columbia, and she's a good friend of this podcast. So let's talk a little bit about Professor Tremlett's research on the MS prodrome. That happens to be a subject that I have a keen interest in because I see understanding the prodromal phase of MS as a step toward proactively treating MS before any of the common MS symptoms are even apparent. And that could mean that someone might never have to experience those symptoms. So, Sharon, I'm hoping you'll start us off by explaining what we mean in medicine when we talk about a prodrome.
So, a prodrome is an early set of signs and symptoms of a disease. And these early signs and symptoms are often non-specific.
Last year, Professor Tremlett and another friend of the podcast, Professor Ruth Ann Mary, co-chaired a workshop presented by the MS Society of Canada and the National MS Society entitled Prodromal Multiple Sclerosis: Gaps, Opportunities, and Priorities. Following that workshop, a paper was published, and following that paper, you produced a lay summary of the workshop and the resulting paper. So what can you tell me about the workshop?
Well, it was convened to develop the framework for MS to include the prodrome, or the early signs and symptoms of MS, because there's a growing body of evidence that this early sign and symptoms stage of MS exists. And the framework was redrawn by the group to include the early stage. Then a research roadmap was drawn. The roadmap was drawn for future research priorities to further improve the understanding and definition of early MS. So standardized criteria can be developed and validated and interventions tested.
I know the participants of the workshop identified 4 major goals that would serve as this roadmap that could focus attention on identifying those strong early markers of MS, as well as identifying opportunities for very early intervention. Can you talk about those goals?
The first one is to gather population-based age and sex-specific estimates for MS worldwide. So that is a prior probability that an individual will in time develop MS before clinical assessment. The second one was to further identify the early signs and symptoms and identify new disease markers for MS. The third is to measure the association between early disease markers and the probability of typical MS, and identifying and validating the markers with high predictive value. And the fourth was to develop and validate criteria for the early signs and symptoms stage of MS for research purposes and find that meaningful point of intervention where patients could be offered prevention to progression of a diagnosis of MS.
And I guess I want to point out to our listeners that when we're talking about these early symptoms, they're not the early symptoms that you think about. They're not things like optic neuritis or waking up one day with that pins and needles feeling in your arm or leg, or perhaps a loss of balance that's unexplained or unexpected. Those are much more common symptoms. What we're talking about are things that happen literally years before those symptoms become apparent. And these can be things like a significant change in mood, perhaps depression, that a large number of people who eventually get diagnosed with MS seem to experience. They can be other kinds of medical conditions, whether we're talking about infection or things that are that don't seem to have anything to do with MS. But when you look at a large number of people who are diagnosed with MS, there are certain commonalities in their early history that create this statistical probability that you're looking at someone who eventually develops MS. Am I getting that right?
Right. So these usually happen 5 to 10 years before the typical symptoms of MS onset. And those, as you pointed out, are the typical symptoms of the optic neuritis and things like that. Those are the symptoms that we all think of as typical MS. The early signs and symptoms may not be noticeable individually by a person. They often happen 5 to 10 years before the development of the classical MS symptom onset.
As I said, this is a subject that really has my attention. If we can start to qualify those symptoms, in other words, if a physician can see that pattern early on, and that's why some of these goals that you just mentioned were so important. But if someone can identify that pattern of symptoms that seem unrelated and certainly don't seem like MS, by identifying them early, perhaps starting that person on a high efficacy disease modifying therapy could mean that those typical symptoms and the progressive disability that we come to associate with MS, well, perhaps we never even get there. Obviously, that's an exciting concept to think about. But what I'd love to talk with you about is how you found yourself taking this often complex science and translating it into language that most anyone can understand. So how did you get here?
In 2016, I started writing for the BMJ group, the British Medical Journal, from a patient perspective. And I was writing of my experience with the healthcare system. And after a few publications, I think I've been published there 7 or 8 times now, I was asked to join the patient editorial board for the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry, where I wrote some editorials about having MS and reflecting directly some papers that they published. And from there, I've been involved with Helen's group for a few years now. Helen has been proactive in involving patients in her research. Several years ago, I was part of a group that had a roundtable discussion looking at the patient perspective and gathering our input before the study was designed to help the efficacy of the study. And from there, I was then tapped to do some lay summaries. And I suppose it's all grown from there. So now I'm writing the lay summaries for all of the published papers that Helen's group will be publishing.
What's important to you about making research more accessible to a broader audience of people who aren't scientists?
It's like a public awareness campaign. Making research accessible is important for many reasons. What I do, a lay summary, and what you do, a podcast, explains in plain language the purpose of the study, why it was done, who were the participants, how the study fits into MS research as a whole, and what impact it might have on people with MS. It promotes understanding of the significance of the research, which can lead to advocacy to support research and then further dissemination. Demystifying often complex subjects allows for a better understanding of a disease people often feel powerless against. We don't know the cause, we don't know the cure, but we can be empowered when we understand the research and the disease better. And sharing the findings of MS research in plain language, it just makes sense. Research is conducted to benefit those of us with MS. it's about us. We're often asked to participate in studies, but we're never informed of the results. And I think people generally are more informed now than they used to be. And healthcare in general is moving toward a more patient-centered approach. And research is too. And part of that movement is sharing results that are easily understood on platforms like your podcast and our blog. And it can also help guide decisions in care and promote more meaningful healthcare appointments.
I just heard you say that understanding the research is empowering. So tell me,
Yes.
what more has to happen to provide people affected by MS greater access to research that's going to be presented the way you present it, in language that's easy for them to understand?
What more is sharing of this blog and your podcast? We need to get the word out about the work that we do so that a wider audience hears it.
Well, I promise to do my part in that, and I trust you will continue doing yours. Sharon Roman, thank you for all you do to help people affected by MS better understand some of the remarkable and, I'll add, encouraging research that's taking place. And thanks for talking with me today.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure, John. It is encouraging research, and we are getting somewhere. But we do need to have the word spread, and we need to have more involvement in disseminating what you and I do so that more people are empowered. Demystifying this disease helps patients feel just a little more empowered against some seemingly big odds.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/265. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.